Good evening, everyone. Thank you and welcome for joining us this evening on what is the last in the series of sustainable home webinars that we've been doing. I may have seen some of you before. My name is Jeremy Miller and I'm the Regional Coordinator for AdaptWest. And I'll be your MC for this evening. I'm really pleased to be here again. It's great. So AdaptWest is one of 4 what are called regional climate partnerships, and ourselves, along with Resilient East, Resilient South, and Resilient Hills and Coast, are really pleased to be able to bring you this series of webinars. It's interesting to note that those regional climate partnerships represent 20 of the councils in South Australia. So, like I said, this is the very last in our Sustainable Homes webinar series, and this is an update to electric vehicles. As you are probably aware from an interest in electric vehicles, you would realise this is a rapidly moving and evolving space. And we did the first one of these webinars last year, and we're lucky again to have Bryce Gaton joining us as our presenter. But before we begin, I would like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the traditional owners of the lands on which I join you from this evening and from the lands you might be joining us from. I join you from the lands of the Ghana people of the Adelaide Plains. I pay my respect to the elders past and present and emerging. And I'd pay our respects to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples that you may be joining us from today as well. So thank you. Thank you for being here. So we've been collaborating with Renew and the regional climate partnerships, and we've been doing these webinars to help us better understand how we can make our homes more resilient to future climate, comfortable, cheaper, better for the planet. So a little bit about Bryce, who's going to be doing this webinar this evening. I've had a few conversations with Bryce recently, and he's an absolute wealth of information on electric vehicles. He's been working in, as well as writing and presenting on the EV sector since 2008. His current role involves writing for Australia's premier EV news site, thedriven.io, running the EV transition support consultancy and EV choice, and providing EV build safety training to a number of Australian university and F-Safe team race teams. Might let Bryce explain what that is if he gets a moment. I did look it up and it looked extraordinarily interesting. In his spare time, Bryce writes on EV topics for a new magazine, as well as regularly presenting for EV issues and opportunities at conferences, public EV information forums and events. He's also a writer behind the EV car fact sheets and webpage found on the Australian Electric Vehicle Association national website. So I think we're in very, very good hands this evening. Thank you, Bryce, for being here and joining us. I'll let you take over and I'll see you a bit later on for the Q&A.
Thank you very much for that lovely introduction, Jeremy. And I'll start doing my screen share. So I'll just do that for a moment while I do that. I come from a teaching background. I tend to take a teaching material approach. So rather than doing sort of a talking head, and you sort of go away thinking as a couple of interesting points, I tend to present it as a set of teaching materials that you can take away and research and study and look at from time to time after the session. So there's a fair bit of information that I'm going to be covering today, but my email address will be available at the very end if you'd like a copy of the slides. And also, as Jeremy has mentioned, there will be a copy of the webinar actually put up online, so the recording of it as well. So if you want to make notes on the way, feel free. If you want the presentation, which has a certain amount of text in it that backs up what I'm saying. So if you don't quite hear me, hopefully I catch you in the text. And again, you can download it later on from me if you send me an email. So tonight I'm trying to cover this sort of set of topics. You know, what is an EV? So give you a bit of technical background, explain a few of the acronyms, talk about the transition in general and what's happening there. And how it's happening worldwide in everything that moves. A little bit about Australian policy, although I won't talk much about that. It's just more about the carrots and sticks that are involved here and around the world to make this change happen. And more about choosing an EV that suits you and your needs. And hopefully sort of this is a good time to reevaluate your needs and perhaps avoid buying a big four-wheel drive SUV or a dual cab ute in case you're only driving around town. It's a really good time to reevaluate that. As I look at some of the current and coming EVs coming to Australia and finish off with some of the EV information sources, as well as a little bit of EV myth-busting. I thought I might throw a couple of those in at the end. So first up, what is an EV? We're looking at basically 4 types. It's the first two are plug-in electric vehicles, the PEV, and the simplest of those is the battery electric vehicle. We have a battery driving electric motor, and as you slow down, that motor turns into a generator because they are one and the same thing. You put power to an electric motor, it drives, and if you basically turn the motor by, with the wheels in this case, or by hand, you put power out of the motor, and that can put some energy back into the battery. So you actually save between 5 and 20% of your energy to put into moving the car off in the first place through that regenerative braking. So you regenerate electricity and put it back into the battery. The plug-in hybrid came about in the days when batteries were really expensive, as I'll talk about in a later slide. Back in 2011-12, they used to cost about $1,200 per kilowatt hour. That's US dollars per kilowatt hour. So add another 50%. So that's what, about $1,800 Australian in sort of adjusted dollars. Nowadays, they're getting down to $110 per kilowatt hour, still US dollars, which means it's an order of magnitude less. So the plug-in hybrid was created when the batteries are super expensive and you wanted to get a reasonable range more than just a daily commute. So it gave you the internal combustion engine, that ICE mentioned there, and it would go for anything beyond what the small battery in there, to try and keep the prices down. They have the disadvantage of have two powertrains, two sets of service. Some of the manufacturers rather like them because they like the idea of getting a constant service stream of fuel, oil filters, all that type of stuff. Whereas the electric motor doesn't have very much at all in the way of servicing. In fact, Tesla don't have a service schedule. It just tells you if something needs doing, which is generally rotate the tires, change the wiper blades, and that's about it, unless it needs something a little more detailed later on. The next one that comes along is the hybrid electric vehicle, HEV. It's basically like a PHEV, PHEV, to plug in, but it doesn't have a plug. So it is basically a fuel saving device. If it runs out of petrol, it stops, because it basically is, as you slow down, you regenerate electricity into the battery, and then you can use the battery to sort of gently increase the acceleration. But they don't work without petrol in them. So taxi drivers love them because they don't cost very much more than a petrol car, but they save them heaps of petrol, costing that 5 to 20%. Given they're driving around town, it's probably more closer to 20%. So that's why they've been so popular with people doing higher mileages. And the last one, the fuel cell electric vehicle, that basically uses hydrogen in a chemical reaction. So you basically have a hydrogen tank. The fuel cell is where this chemical reaction takes place to create electricity to charge a small battery that then drives the electric motor. So it's still an electric vehicle, but it has all sorts of interesting technology sort of to get around the fact that the hydrogen doesn't like fast acceleration, so it has to have the battery to sort of buffer that. So if you want to do a quick acceleration, it draws off the battery more quickly than it draws off the fuel cell. Again, you can't regenerate hydrogen as you slow down, so you need the battery to regen that energy back into the battery. I'll talk a little bit more about hydrogen cars when I do some myth busting later on. Suffice it to say that they're on their way out already. They basically too expensive to run, too expensive to produce the electricity, and lots of technical problems still. The hybrid electric vehicle, by the way, when the bans that come about on the sale of internal combustion engine vehicles at various dates, they are included in the fossil fuel car ban. So the hybrid electric vehicle will disappear with that, but the plug-in hybrids and the BEVs will cross that threshold. Talk a little bit more about that later. I do like to throw this slide in because battery electric vehicles are not a new phenomenon. That's a 1906 electric vehicle. This lovely lady dressed up to the nines showing off her very not safe looking electric car charger. The detail with them was people loved them in terms of driving them around, got nice and quiet and didn't scare the horses. The other side of the coin was electricity was nowhere near as ubiquitous as we find it is now. So you could get a recharge in the central business districts of the biggest cities in the world. And outside of that, you're pretty much on your own for trying to get a recharge. Whereas a petrol car, you could strap drums, 2-gallon tins of petrol to the side of the car and you could go pretty much anywhere. Someone could dump a 44-gallon drum and let you refuel. So that's how the petrol car won at the start of last century. And the electric car then it didn't die off, but it just putted away in the background sort of as the technology developed to the development point that they have reached today where they're taking over. So EV transitions, well, we have seen transitions before. But in this case, we're going to see it in everything that moves. So, trucks, that's a Tesla truck in the middle right there, and the bottom, that's the Scania truck, and they'll actually be driving the new Mercedes trucks on Thursday. They're doing a launch event for those, some large size, medium, large rigid trucks. Machinery, yes, mining machinery, including coal mining machinery, is going electric. A lot safer underground, for instance, is one example. A lot less maintenance required. The fumes, all that stuff is gone. Tractors will be going electric. That one there will be turning up in Australia in about 2026, I believe that's due for launch. Um, Bicycles and scooters. Yes, as I mentioned a bit earlier, it's a good time to reevaluate your transport needs when you're changing or getting rid of your old internal combustion engine car. There may be times an electric bicycle is all you may need. The number of people getting around on scooters these days, you can even buy electric cargo bikes, as you can see there. And believe it or not, electric motorcycles are also available. That is what was a Harley Davidson Livewire. They've spun that out as a separate business now, so it's called Livewire. I think Harley felt slightly awkward about selling a quiet electric motorbike that didn't quite fit with the image. So, but it is still a Harley Davidson. It's just a sub brand of theirs. Then you've got electric planes. Yes, they are a thing. And that middle one in the blue sky is a flight trainer. There's a small fleet of them here in Australia already for flight training. They do about an hour. Really good for not annoying the neighbours around local airports as they're training pilots. That other one there, the Alice, as it's called, is currently going through what do they call it? Certification trials at the moment in America. That is a 9-seater, effectively an executive jet replacement. Norway say by 2040 they expect all short-haul aircraft flights to be electric. Flying cars, that is called the Black Fly. It's registered for sale in the US. Ultimately, they expect it to become an autonomous thing, so it'll do its own thing, a single passenger. It'll land, you'll call it up on an app, it'll land next to you, and it's vertical takeoff and landings, or take off and take you to where you want to go. So Jetsons, here we come, for those who remember the cartoon Jetsons from, I think, the 60s. Autonomous cars, so you hop in and it'll pick you up from a tram stop or a bus stop and take you your last few kilometres. That was actually built here in Australia, actually in an eastern suburb of Melbourne. A small business called AEV. It's not that small anymore. It's getting quite big, and that's overseas being trialled at the moment. Electric buses are quite a big thing around the world, and there are a number of bus trials and buses rolling out in Australia. I always like to use the example of a city in China where they've changed. I think there's 10,000 fleet of buses, and believe it or not, they didn't bring down the grid doing it, and it's doing very well there. Just as one example. Electric ferries are a thing, and that one's the Ampera. That has about 30 cars and several hundred passengers. Incat down in Tasmania is building one for much bigger, that takes a much larger number of cars and passengers, and I've gone blank on exactly how many. The next Renew article, the next Renew magazine will actually have that more detailed information about that and a number of other things when the electrification of watercraft is going about. And of course, the general equipment. Most of my gardening equipment now is all electric, and councils love that particular one there. It'll run all day on a battery charge, and it will charge overnight on a 10, 15-hour power plant. Be ready to go the next day with vastly less maintenance. As I've mentioned a couple of times, transitions have happened before. And this is the last time we had a vehicle transport transition. First photo there, April 1900, Fifth Avenue in New York. So a nice affluent area. People can afford to make the change early. And there's one horseless carriage in that photo on the left, circled in red. And on the right, you might just see the swishing of a tail, only 13, 14 years later. There's one horse and carriage, and everything has been replaced with the horseless carriage, the petrol car. So these things have happened before. And it's not just in cars. If you're ever really bored one day, head to ourworldindata.org and you can check out the transitions of all sorts of technologies, as well as lots of other interesting facts about the world. As you can see, everything from the flush toilet down to the tablet computer, computer, air conditioning, the car itself, as they list there, has a typical curve. It starts off a little bit slowly, takes off quite rapidly as it exponentially increases, then it sort of tapers off at the end as the last people realize, well, the transition's happened, and we can't buy what we used to. Can't get a horse and cart, for instance, anymore, so it's probably easier to get a car. And that's what happened in the past. And strangely enough, this is the sort of curve Australia's following, if that looks familiar, because it's the start of that same technology adoption curve. And Europe, it's a lot further down the track. England, for instance, is 1 in 4. Europe, in fact, is 1 in 4 cars are plug-in, most of those being the full battery electric vehicle. In Norway, 91% of all vehicle sales, because they have a cut-off date of 2025 for the ending of internal combustion engine cars. So they have reached basically game over point. 91% were plug-in electric vehicles, and it was only 2 or 3% were the plug-in hybrids. So in maturing markets, the plug-in hybrid itself will basically die out because it's no longer price competitive compared to the very cheap batteries that are starting to come out now. I have thrown this slide in to remind you, electric vehicles very, very rarely catch fire. So cars have really well-built batteries, good charging systems, all very expensive batteries and battery management systems. There's a lot of very cheap bicycles out there, so beware, and scooters. E-bikes, as I said there, and scooters can and do. We've had a number of fires being reported around Australia and the world. So a little bit of warning for, don't be afraid to get them, but get good quality ones, known brands with their proper Australian compliance, not something off Fleabay or Alibaba that do bring in yourself, and just buyer beware. Basically, if they're cheap, they're probably not that good a battery or battery management system or charging system. Always use the charger that came with it. Just because the plug fits doesn't mean it's compatible. It may give it the wrong voltage. It may give it too much current. All sorts of things can be wrong if you use the wrong charger. It's also worth making sure that don't park it on top of a pile of papers in your lounge room, in right next to the exit door. Park it on a hard surface like concrete or tiles, that type of thing. And once it's fully charged, unplug it. Again, they have cheap batteries, cheap battery management systems in a number of them. A good quality one, it shouldn't hurt being left plugged in. Like most mobile phones, it doesn't hurt to leave them plugged in, but the cheap ones do have an issue. So just be aware of that. And if you want any more information, New South Wales government has an interesting fact sheet to download. Back to electric cars themselves. That's sort of my focus in the world, so I tend to talk more about them than everything else. But I'll run through a few acronyms here. The EVSE, it's electric vehicle supply equipment, and it's basically a car charger. And there's basically 3 broad categories. There's your ones that plug into power points. The top one there is the sort of thing that comes with a car. It's just a 3-pin plug, plugs into ordinary 10 amp power point. The bottom one there is the sort of thing you use if you're going off the beaten DC fast charger track, and that will do anything up to 32 amp 3-phase, depending on how much your car can charge at. And I carry one of those around when I'm doing things like, I live in Melbourne and I've driven to Perth before. I do Melbourne to Sydney runs a lot. Generally these days, I don't even take that with me Melbourne, Sydney. It's Melbourne, Perth, or into outback regions. I'll take it with me. Otherwise, it's not a particularly urgent item, as I'll explain a bit later. They're the plug-in ones. Then there's your hardwired type thing, and I will talk a lot more about them a bit later. Councils love the one on your left, the one with the little socket, because it's a BYO charger, it's called, because it's being your own lead. So you plug your lead from that to the car, and it's like the airlines in the service stations. If a charger has a lead attached to it, it tends to get a bit battered around like the airlines service stations. Whereas if you had your own airline plugged in at the service station, you would tend to look after it and leave it in the boot whilst it's being cared for. So that's why the councils and things love them. For your own use, though, I always recommend one with the tethered lead, as in it's attached to the charger. That's a classic brand there, the Wallbox. And I find the tethered lead for home use is the best because you just unplug it and wrap it around the charger when you finish. That's your AC charging, and I'll talk about the speeds and how fast you'll charge with those in a moment. But then you have basically what will be the roadhouse, the Melbourne to Sydney, Melbourne to Adelaide, Adelaide to Darwin type chargers, when you actually want your roadhouse type chargers and speeds, and they're your DC fast charger, and they charge via a different pair of pins in the charging port and are much, much faster, as I'll show. I think it's in the next slide or one after. I'll actually show you the charging speeds, but they will do that one that plugs into the power point there at the top left. That'll do maybe 2 kilowatts. The fastest of those chargers at one right to 150 times that, nearly 175 times that speed that you would plug into a power point. So you can imagine you get a pretty fast charge on the big ones. And obviously if you're sleeping at night, maybe the plug-in one will do the job perfectly. So also get asked about the plug war as it used to be. These are the 3 main plug types in the world. That's the Australian one. That's pretty much everything bar 2 cars coming into Australia now have that pair of plugs, and the 2 that come in are older models. One is the Nissan Leaf, which is being replaced by the Nissan Ariya sometime in the next year or so, and that will have that combination. And the Lexus 300e, which has, again, that same AC plug and a different DC plug, and that's that pairing there. So both the Nissan Leaf and the Lexus 300e have that pairing of a separate DC plug called a CHAdeMO, but the same type 2 plug for the AC. But everything else comes in with that CCS combo. In Japan, they use that. So if you get a older car that was brought here up until about 2017, they probably have that combination when it comes from Japan. And if you get a Japanese domestic market, a JDM import, brought in by a good car company, a number of others, they will have that pair as well, because that's the pair used in Japan. For the AC side, you just use an adapter, about $150 adapter, so that's no issue. To the DC side, at the moment, the DC plugs are disappearing rapidly in CHAdeMO, but there are some adapters being brought in and certified at the moment. So you should soon be able to do an adapter from the CHAdeMO to the CCS plug as well. So you'll still be able to drive them. You just need a couple of adapters. But all the Australian imported vehicles come with that middle one there. People often ask me about, well, what about Tesla in America? That's America. We're using a variation of that combined charging system to CCS, which had the Type 1 plug there and the 2 big pins at the bottom. So it's called CCS1, strangely enough. But all the manufacturers jumped on board with Tesla, who had their own plug. All the manufacturers jumped on board with Tesla last year. So America dropped the CCS1 system and used the Tesla plug. But we'll never see that here for a very simple reason. America has a peculiar electricity system, very different as a single-phase, two-phase system, whereas the rest of the world uses the three-phase system, which is why we have the Type 2 plug. So we'll never see the NACS plug here, but basically North America is standard on NACS. Europe and the rest of the world, including us, are standardized on the CCS2, and Japan's probably looking at that going, we got a problem. We shall see what happens there. There's a coming trend I often get asked about. So V to X, or vehicle to something. So getting power out of the battery as well as just putting power into it. V2L is vehicle to load. So there's 2 things shown there. The early CHAdeMO systems got that out of the DC plug. So you had to buy an adapter, big box, about $10,000 worth, to change it from DC to AC. So you can see that guy with his jackhammer, this big box changing from the DC out of the socket to AC and then running that. Very expensive. CCS learnt, because it is a later kid on the block, learnt how to do a better job of that, and actually just to plug into the AC port. And it's often comes free with the car. So that adapter there, it's a Hyundai one. Some of the manufacturers are charging maybe $100 or $200 for them. MG and BYD, just throw them in with the car. That's very simple and cheap. So that's done via the AC for the CCS system and DC, but you can't buy those DC boxes anymore anyway. Although the Good Car Company is currently in the process of trying to compliance one to bring it in, but will still be about $5,000. The next layer up is vehicle to home or vehicle to building, if it's sort of a units or a business. And that basically puts power out to a box on the wall next to the switchboard, and it provides just the building or the house. So it basically turns the grid off, turns on the power from the car, and you'll run the house on AC out of the car. And third layer up is vehicle to grid. So like your solar panels or some battery systems at the moment, home battery systems where you can actually put power, charge them up cheaply with your solar and put power to run your house at night. And it's all seamless. The power doesn't turn off at all in the house, and you can put extra power out to the grid if you want a sort of tariff that will actually give you a bit of a payment for that. So that's vehicle to grid. Now a little bit of summary on that. Those 2 are done through the DC plug at the moment. Currently, CHAdeMO, which was originally designed in Japan for its earthquakes and all that sort of stuff, tsunamis, they wanted a backup system, so CHAdeMO was designed right from the start in 2012 to do that. But the CHAdeMO plug lost, as I call the plug war. CCS is being developed, and there's actually a roadmap that by next year it will be fully vehicle to X, so vehicle to building and grid capable. And many cars in the CCS network or the ecosystem already do vehicle to load, and some cars are actually starting to be built with it overseas to have the vehicle home and grid. Home and grid, by the way, are basically the same thing, but one is reliant on the grid talking to the box on the wall. So that's where the grid comes in, and so you can put power out to the grid itself. So home is just for your home use, and grid means you can provide power to the grid. And there's a slight bit of electronic trickery to make sure it all matches. And that's basically the hold up at the moment. So vehicle to home, the standards are changing at the moment, and we'll be able to start bringing in the boxes from Europe later this year. So if you want to be an early adopter and pay through the nose for it, you could probably start putting it in very late this year or early next year. But the vehicle to grid stuff, where you could actually arbitrage and sell power back, buy low, sell high. So you put your own solar power into the battery, into the car, and sell it at a high rate on a hot summer's afternoon. The grid communications aren't fully agreed yet. That's maybe happening later this year, early next year, and then the grid communications will happen, and then vehicle to grid will happen, but not yet. So you can hold your horses, please, if you want vehicle to grid. Vehicle to home, maybe 6 to 12 months. Vehicle to grid, maybe 18 months or 2 years. Now we're coming to refueling. We're used to this. The internal combustion engine, we go out of our way to find a petrol station and refuel somewhere during our trip. And that's what we're used to. We just wander around, and we're just used to pulling up and spending 5 or 10 minutes refueling, paying, heading back onto the beaten track where you're going. Electric vehicles, our destination now becomes the charging point. So we don't have to hang around waiting for it if we're only doing a commute. So most of the time, you charge at home. 80, 90% of charging stats are that you do it at home, but you can do it at the library, you can do it at the shops. Workplace charging will become a thing in the future because lots of solar and what have you during the day. There will be lots of incentives from government to put in chargers, and many businesses will be incentivized to be a employer of choice and will put in workplace charging. So that's going to happen. Even going to the park, some of you may have already seen chargers popping up there. So the key point is it's like a mobile phone. You plug it in when you're just home or asleep. It's not sort of stand there and act as a fuel pump attendant, which is what we're used to. I always say once you get used to an EV, driving or going to petrol stations, a bit like having a sore toe. You wander around with a sore toe and get used to it. But once the sore toe's gone away, you realise just how limiting it was. And petrol stations a bit like that. You don't realise just how much a nuisance they were until you don't go there anymore. So how fast do you need to charge? Because this new paradigm means charging speeds matter. And first up, if you're only doing 100 Ks or less in a day, PowerPoint will probably do you fine. And that'll give you, as I'll talk about in a slide or two, that will give you maybe 4 hours of charging. It'll throw you back 50 kilometers of charge. So if you're doing 30, 50 kilometers a day, 4 hours overnight, done. And that's basically, they must be connected back to the switchboard on their own circuit. That's about $500 for an electrician. Put that in with a nice simple install. Please, by the way, don't use just ordinary household extension leads. They're often only rated for 10 amps or less, and that's all the connections aren't all that good. A bit of moisture on them. If you must use an extension lead, use one that's at least 15, 20 amp rated with its good screw together weatherproof plugs, and avoid using them wherever possible is my recommendation. If you one car charge, if you do a full range in a day, which is unusual but can happen, I can get a full charge 0 to 100% with my Kona in about 8-9 hours. Not that I almost never roll into 0%, maybe only a couple of times in my life, and I only go to 100% if I'm going, doing an interstate trip. Otherwise, I charge it to about 80% all the time. It's like a petrol car. You don't go below quarter tank or 3/4 of a tank unless you really need it. If you go below a quarter of a tank, you'll suck up a bit of dirt and water or whatever. So you try not to go down there. The same with putting fully fuel tankers. It might go stale if you don't use it fully. And battery cars are exactly the same. So keep it between 20 and 80% most of the time. It doesn't hurt to go below 20% down to 10 or 5. It certainly doesn't hurt to take it up to 100 if you're driving it in the next day. But be kind to the battery and just keep it between 80 and 20 for most of the time, except if you need to use those top and bottom 20%. And overnight charge, as I said, is about 9 hours. And they're about the cheapest of those for the tethered lead ones is about $600-700 and a similar price. So you're looking at maybe $1,400-1,500 installed. Of course, there's some U-Butte ones, as I'll talk about later, the smart chargers, and they might be $3,000-4,000, but they'll do everything but make coffee in the morning. So it's your choice. So this is that table I was talking about. If you're plugging into a PowerPoint there, the red line, that 1.8 number there, is what, generally speaking, is what will come with the car that's in the boot. And it'll give you, I like the kilometers charged per hour figure. So it'll give you about 12 kilometers charged per hour. So 4 hours of that, nearly 50 kilometers recharged. 15 amp power point, will double that. So you're looking at maybe 24 kilometers charged. So I often say that caravan parks and EVs are a marriage made in heaven. If you roll in to a caravan park at maybe 30% charge, plug in at 5 o'clock in the evening, wander off for dinner, go to sleep. By 8 next morning, you're ready to go 100% charged to the rest of your trip. And I used to do that a lot before the DC chargers were rolled out if I was doing country trips for work and what have you. As you can see below there on that bottom left-hand corner, for the average house, 7.4 kilowatts is your maximum speed. That's a single phase house, and almost all houses are single phase. So if you look at your Eve, you'll see just 2 wires connected there. That means you're single phase. And then your best number is 48, 50 kilometers charge an hour. I'll get a full charge overnight. So it really doesn't matter if you're only a single phase house. You will get a full charge with a 32 amp 2.4 kilowatt charger. If you happen to have 3-phase charging, and almost all cars on the road now will charge at 3-phase 11 kilowatts, which means you can get 70-ish kilometers charged per hour. So you'll be charged in, what's that, about 6 hours instead of 9. That gives you some numbers. If you're one of the few that are 22 kilowatts, and there are more, they're more luxury ones, although the Renault Zoe, for instance, will do 22. You get nearly 150 kilometers charged. Now, Renault Zoe will charge in about 2.75 hours, for instance. Why you'd want to, I don't know, but they are capable of doing it. And I put in on the right there the DC fast chargers, and I've changed the metric there and said, how many, so I have put kilometers charged in now, but a nice number is 100 kilometers. How fast will it charge 100 kilometers? So a 50 kilowatt charger, which is the early ones that rolled out 4 or 5 years ago, 20 minutes for 100 Ks. So my Kona is quite happy on that one because it's about 5 years. Actually, next month it'll be 5 years old. It will basically do no more than 70 kilowatts on DC. So 20 minutes for 100 kilometers. I might stop for 30 minutes 2 or 3 times on the way to Sydney. So it doesn't add a lot of time at all. These days, though, most cars are at least 150 kilowatts charging. So you'll be stopping maybe 15 minutes instead. Barely long enough to go to the toilet and have a cup of coffee. So that's getting it down to a good roadhouse number. And don't forget, you're plugging in and wandering in. You're not pulling up, refueling, then parking, and then going in. You just pull up at the charger, plug it in. So you save that 5 minutes of standing there and refueling and paying before you move. So that's the 150 kilowatts. A lot of cars getting above that. Teslas, Hyundais are getting it to 50 kilowatts. Hyundai Ioniq 5, for instance, will do an 80% charge in about 17 minutes. Porsche talking about putting in 350 kilowatt charging, which means to be just over 2.5 minutes per 100 kilometers. 10 minutes for a recharge. Pretty much game over as far as matching it with petrol when you get to those sort of numbers, and that's not far away. Although I do add this little thing for the home charging. If you need to do more than 4 hours charging more than twice a week, go up a step in charging. So if you're doing more than 2 4-hour charges on a PowerPoint a week, maybe look at putting a 15 amp charge PowerPoint in. If you're doing that on a 15 amper, look at putting in a dedicated charger. So that's part of the course that I teach for electricians. That's just a rule of thumb I use for designing and installation. I'll forget the question of how far can I go on a charge. Range estimates vary wildly. As you can see from my Hyundai Kona there, the NEDC number, which Australia still uses because it's old policy standards, 557, I would not get that in a pink fit in my Kona. NEDC is, I generally call it not even darn close. However, 484 for the European number, that's very comfortably what I'll get around town. I'll get up to 500 kilometers around town driving. So the WLTP number is a really good number if you're looking at what's my real range around town. If you're going out on a highway, I find about 410 to 420 for a long run, 100, 110 kilometers an hour is about right. And the US EPA number is based on a slightly different charging standard driving standard where they do more higher speed, longer runs. So they've basically come up with that US EPA number. So if you're looking for a car, well, you can compare them on NEDC numbers to see which one goes further, but don't expect to go there in the distance. But if you drive around town a lot, use the WLTP number. And if you're doing regional driving a lot, use the US EPA number to give you some realistic numbers of what you're likely to get. Some manufacturers, by the way, are slightly better at quoting the numbers or truer numbers. Hyundai are very good at quoting quite conservative values, and often people get more. Tesla tend to be a bit over optimistic, so sometimes you get a bit less than the US EPA and WLTP numbers with Teslas. As I said, with Hyundais, you might get a little more, but it's roughly right. The next couple of bits in the slide are just for people that just want to remember. I didn't want to make notes just as I was babbling. So I've just put those things there. NEDC, by the way, is commonly around 30% too high. Europe changed over in 2017 to that WLTP number purely because the NEDC was getting to be ridiculous. And in the US EPA, as I said there. If you're going to Renew magazine, for those of you who subscribe, edition 155 does a much longer article about this particular topic. If you haven't got Renew magazine subscription, I would highly recommend you do. But if not, those articles are actually at my website, evchoice.au on EV information tab. Does an EV go the distance? Well, that was me mid-22, so it's 2 years ago now, driving to Perth to run some safety training for the universities over there. Yes, so I have headed all the way across the Nullarbor and back quite comfortably. Although this particular thing here, if you look at those dots, if you want to find the charges on the network, after Adelaide, when I left for Perth, there was no charges until I got to that Mandurah Pass charger. They're just to your left from Adelaide on. Nowadays, as you can see, they're bobbing up all over the place, and I would find it a much easier trip. Those orange dots are just DC chargers. That PlugShare app or program, as you can see there, I can filter for the number of plugs. If I filter for AC type, so the wall mount type stuff plus DC, the wall mount type ones are the green dots in the right-hand slide there, or right-hand picture. And it's getting to be a very big network rolling out. When you think about it, this is at the very early days still. Back in when did I start driving EVs? 2012, when I had my own. Before that, we were building them in 2008 on. I think there was, by 2012, I think there was 2 or 3 chargers in the whole of Victoria. Now we have 100 or more, I think, and there's many more than that. As you can see, the network is growing pretty much daily. So you go to the PlugShare, just filter for your plugs, and you can see what's happening. Back last year, 2 years ago, when I headed over to Perth, the Poochera pub was the classic spot where you took a photo of being parked on the footpath because you had to use the 3-phase outlet between Adelaide, Port Augusta and Ceduna. These days, there's actually DC chargers scattered along the way, so I don't have to do that anymore. My car, by the way, does 7 kilowatt maximum AC charging, so I had to sit there for 3 hours to get my little top up. If I had an 11 kilowatt charger in the car, I would have been there for 2 hours. And if I had a car that did 22 kilowatt AC charging, I would have been there for 1 hour. My next car will have 22 kilowatt charging, but that's purely because of my particular needs for long distance and off the beaten track driving. But for most people, pardon me, 7 or 22 is fine. For the future, well, this is what you're going to be. Most of your charging, if you've got off-street parking, will be done at home. 70 to 90% the stats are. Then there's your workplace charging, your shopping centres and that in France. Oh, pardon me. In France, they said any car park more than 80 car park spots must have a solar charger. And then that's a perfect match to put in chargers alongside of, sorry, not solar panels, solar roofs, and they're perfect to match up with chargers. Then there's the public charging networks. There's me again parked at the Adelaide Central bus station when I was heading over to Perth 2 years ago. And as you can see, there's a selection of EVs plugged in and charging at that time. And there's actually another plug-in hybrid next to that white Porsche there. And there's actually another couple of chargers to the right of me. Then you have the public networks themselves. That's the Tesla network, of which they use the same plug as everyone else in Australia now. So they're actually opening up to general use, although they are the most expensive network. They're trying to keep it Tesla only. But if you want to use that maybe less than 5% of the time on your interstate trip, you'd probably pay an extra 10 or 20 cents a kilowatt hour and not notice for over the year. But yeah, you can use actually Tesla chargers for about half of them, and they will all open up eventually. Then you've got the NRMA network through New South Wales, and ChargeFox was actually bought by NRMA, RACV, all the roads authorities actually now own ChargeFox. So that NRMA network is being rolled into that, and it's basically a for-profit network like BP and those things, and you got BP Pulse, those types of ones, and that's a ChargeFox thing that's now being rolled out at a roadhouse just in the north of Victoria. Finding a local station, so I said, plug share is the way to go. So there you'll click on one of those icons. It'll often say, show it as, is it being used by someone or not? And plug share, there's a lot of really good details about it, including if there's something happens to be wrong with one of them. For the providers like BP Pulse, AmpPol, those types of people, at ChargeFox, you download an app onto your phone. There's EV, AmpCharge, there's a BP Pulse, ChargeFox. In England, as an example, they got really frustrated with provider apps being all different and having to sign up to each one. And they've brought in a law that they must be all interoperable, and any charger over 50 kilowatts must have a credit card facility to make life a lot easier. And that will happen here. We're just behind. As I said, 1 in 4 cars in England is a plug-in electric car. Here we're sort of just about to reach 1 in 10 in terms of sales. So once we get a bit further down the track, I'm sure there will be a legislation put in saying, you must, guys, talk to each other and your apps must be interchangeable. Some of them are starting to do that already, and some of them are getting into credit card apps users on them as well. Promoting EV uptake, I won't go to a great deal of detail, but there's sort of 3 ways of doing it. You could offer carrots, EV subsidies and things. Sticks, policy to make the manufacturers make their cars more efficient, which is what our new vehicle efficiency standard is all about. And then there's policy, sort of adopting for EVs, so tax changes, all that type of stuff, sort of fringe benefits tax. So all of those things together will move us off fossil fuels into less polluting, more zero emission vehicles. That's the whole idea. Big stick, however, was, as I mentioned earlier, the bans. In Europe and the rest of the world, these are the sort of numbers. They were setting themselves individual numbers in Europe. They've recently agreed 2035 internal combustion engine sale vehicles, so including hybrids, not plug-in hybrids. They're okay with electric cars because they plug in. They're the sort of numbers that we're talking about. So as I said, Norway, which made 2025, it's pretty much game over. It's over 90% plug-in electric vehicles. As a result, the manufacturers have actually seen the writing on the wall, and they're starting to set dates to end their own sales. So a lot of manufacturers have said, okay, we'll be EV only in Europe to begin with. Volvo, interestingly, have said we'll be EV only in Australia first up. So 2026, Volvo will only sell full battery plug-in electric vehicles here in Australia, and 2030 for Europe and the rest of the world. Even General Motors, you would have thought the big American business would have said no. We're sticking with petrol cars. 2035, they won't be building petrol cars anymore. Renault will be Europe only, BEV only in Europe. Ford will be BEV only in Europe by 2030. 2030 is sort of a big number. A bit of a selection of EVs that you can buy now. So look at some of the options. I didn't put in a lot of the ones that are coming this year, though there's 30 new models coming this year. I've just put in the ones that are basically around 40 grand that have just arrived as an inclusion to the BYD Dolphin, around 41,500. MG4, they've just lowered the price to just under 40 grand. These are on the road prices. I'm using the numbers in Victoria because we have no subsidies here. So that's any state that has any form of subsidy, it will be cheaper. Queensland, for instance, had a $6,000 subsidy. Take 6 grand off an MG4, you're getting down to $34,000 on the road. The Volvo EX30 has just arrived. By all reports, a really nice car, certainly very well put together. I had a look at one last weekend. Nissan Ariya has been promised for the last 18 months. We may see it this year. For those of you who are waiting, there's the two based on the Toyota platform, the Toyota BZ4X, and you would have seen the Barry ads that's become available, and the Subaru Solterra, based the same car. They've just become available too. And so Hyundai Kona actually just returned one on Monday, yesterday. Had one for a 10-day test drive. I'll be writing up a test report on that for the driven, sort of the new versus old Kona in the next week or so. And of course, there's the BEV utes and vans. Yes, the ute is on its way. There is one available in Australia now, a very early EV ute for those for whose purposes it suits. It works very well, but it is slightly limiting at the moment. But there's more coming. Uh, Overseas, there's some really good ones. The Rivian ute, if you go search for Rivian, it's a new company like Tesla, fully startup electric vehicle company. And they're building, I think, have sold over 60 or 70,000 of them already in the US. There's one in Australia at the moment driving around, and they're actually going to bring out the R2 soon, which will be a slightly smaller version, and maybe, oh, not maybe, they are bringing out an R3 SUV version as well. The Ford e-Transit's already here, and the Ford e-Transit Customs, the 1-ton van, is being launched later this month in Europe, and that will be coming here later this year, I believe. So I put an H1, so it'll be here somewhere around the middle of this year, perhaps, and a number of others there. So, like commercial vehicles, they're doing basically what passenger cars have done. We've got 60 odd passenger car models now, another 30 this year. We have 14 like commercial vehicle models here in Australia at the moment. We'll have another 16 this year. Now, affording, yes, well, they're still generally in the 60 grand or above. As you can see there, some are getting under 40. And it's that same thing about that $1,200 down to much, much cheaper, order of magnitude less per kilowatt hour of battery capacity. I think they're talking at the moment, it's getting down around $115, $110 for some of the Chinese batteries this year. So it's getting very close. That red line is when it hits $100 US per kilowatt hour. That's the price parity point with an equivalent petrol car. Now, do BEVs benefit the environment? People often ask, is it really worth bothering? Are they any better? The environment, they do not give you any tailpipe pollution. They will reduce overall emissions compared to a petrol car. That graph there, I'll put a little more detail in my little debunk in a minute. But to compare a current model Corolla to a car run on any grid in South Australia, you're about 50% renewables, and you'll put in about a third of the amount of carbon emissions running your car off the grid than you would if you were running a petrol car. That's some numbers there. Negligible emissions if you're running off solar, by the way. No coolants, oil, plug filters, brake pads, so a lot less because that regenerative braking is slowing down using the motor as your means rather than brake pads, so you save them a lot less wear on them. And you obviously service costs reduced, electricity is cheaper. This is a little comparison. I might whiz through it. Just some assumptions. These are Kona petrol versus Kona electric. If anybody wants to look into the assumptions, you can read those later if you want these slides. But the deal is the electricity for the Kona will be about just under $300. The petrol is nearly $1,300. So you're going to save about $950. The service estimate, Hyundai put the prices up on the Kona, even though it's, I think put the data there. Yep. My Kona is about $180 a year to service. They're saying $520 every 2 years for a service, which would be a bit rich. I suppose they want to keep their service income somehow and keep their businesses going. But it's still cheaper than the internal combustion engine. But there's going to be some sorting out. There's no reason why you can't take it to a private person once more mechanics become trained up in EVs. When you should charge an EV is an interesting one. Lots of solar during the day. This is the duck curve, as it was called, first identified in early 2012, somewhere around there, for Canada. For California, as the years have gone by and there's more and more solar and wind, that belly of the duck is getting bigger and bigger, and the poor old coal-fired generators are struggling to be turned up and down to match the demand. So EVs are a marriage made in heaven here, because if you can control the charging, so you have a grid connected charger and you're plugged in, the grid can say, we've got some really cheap electricity now, charge your car now. And that will soak up the belly there. And the same thing, if you don't want to put lots of electricity use in the evening when everyone goes home, those smart chargers will be able to ramp the charging down. They won't turn off, but they'll ramp it down a bit. So smart chargers can actually go up and down a little bit quite a lot in the amount of charge they're putting in for maybe half an hour when that peak's happening in a hot summer's day with the air conditioners running. So as a result, even now with a very simple, dumb system of just saying, okay, we'll give you a super off-peak rate when it's lots of solar and nobody's using electricity, 8.2 cents. This is in the EV add-on in WA per kilowatt hour. Really cheap time to be recharging. Overnight peak rate, off-peak, I should say, in general, 18.5 sort of number. Off-peak rate, as you can see there. And if you really want to charge, you really need that charge at 51 cents. So try and discourage fuel. So even just as price signal, it's a good way to encourage fuel to charge the right time. Remember, EV charging is discretionary, unlike an air conditioner on a hot day when you really, really want it then and not wait till the evening. An EV can be recharged later or earlier, depending on when it's cheap. Models for balancing and charging, I'll whiz through this a little bit, but I look at it as three ways of thinking about it. I'll put a QR code in just to an article, much longer detail. Is your dumb chargers, which is basically a PowerPoint. You plug in your charger, it turns on at that moment, and it charges at the full rate or whatever the charger can do. You need to understand it and decide when you want to charge it up and down or turn it on and off. So if you have a solar system, you'll plug in at maybe 10 o'clock and turn it off at 2 o'clock, that type of thing. And you might have a charger, a button that you can take a lower charge thing, but very dumb charging. Then you've got your smart-ish chargers where you can basically use an app on the phone or a screen on the charger itself, and you can program it. So you can say, I don't want it to charge after 3 in the afternoon, but it can charge after 11 at night. I can set up the tariff so when it's cheaper, I can run it. I can set it up that it'll measure how much solar I'm doing and only use solar to charge. That's perfectly possible, and it ramps the car charging rate up and down. So you need to understand it. You need a little bit of a techie nerd maybe to do it. I call it the smartish charger. It all happens behind the meter. The grid can't control anything there, but if you program it all, it will do most things for you. It's not quite set and forget, but summer and winter, the tariffs may change, so you may want to adjust it. But then you come to the smart charger. That's where the grid communications come in. That won't be happening, as I said, until 2025, 26. But then if you subscribe to a tariff that allow smart charging and the grid to ramp your charging up and down or to charge when it's really low and cheap, that will be you can have grid managed as well as your own settings to get the best of all worlds in charging. So there's sort of 3 layers. There's a QR code there if you want to go to a much longer article on that topic. Again, you can download the slides later and grab that QR code. Future-proofing your charger installation. There are some trials in South Australia of the CHAdeMO system. By the way, you can't buy the box that will do the CHAdeMO vehicle to grid stuff anymore. That was the Wallbox 1. The Wallbox 2 will be CCS only. So that's if you've got an old Wallbox 1 kicking around that hasn't been installed yet, I've heard of 1 or 2. They're worth a fortune. There's a lot of people want them. So smart chargers may actually be mandated in the future. So if you're putting in more than a PowerPoint, you may have to put in proper chargers happening overseas. Your vehicle to grid type stuff or vehicle to home is coming. So be prepared. Put in the biggest cable needed. So it's a 32 ohm cable. Talk to your electrician. Even if you just put a PowerPoint on the end now, just put the bigger cable in and you just change the PowerPoint to breaker later. Data cables are really handy for that smart grid stuff, run it between the charger and the switchboard, or if it's a new build, between the charger and your data hub and the switchboard and the data hub. Some will be Wi-Fi. Wouldn't hurt to throw the data cables in now just as a backup plan. And get a charger with an open charge point protocol, the right one or the later one's an open source 1.6 or above, and that will be a smart charger when it happens. Fingers crossed. I wouldn't take that as gospel, but it's most chargers now are 2.0 above. So you should be safe if you get a smart charger now that it will be able to do the vehicle to grid stuff later. Sorry, not just vehicle to grid, it can do smart charging. So even if it's not vehicle to grid, you will at least turn on and off and ramp up and down. If that's all a bit too much detail for you, there is a course being developed for electricians. I was part of the steering group writing it, and it's now available as a course for TAFEs all around, or any training provider around Australia as an accredited course. So it can be counted towards their trade course or other qualifications. That's the number. So if it's an electrician in tonight, pester your local TAFE for that code, and they can actually put that on their system and they can start delivering it. Bit of EV myth busting. I thought I'd throw that in as a sort of a final thing. People keep asking me, EVs catch fire a lot. Not true. This is sort of numbers. It's hybrid vehicles. You might get 3,500 per 100,000 sales. Petrol vehicles, maybe 1,500 will go up in flames, and electric vehicles, 25. So it's several orders of magnitude. And I've seen a recent another study of the same sort of numbers. I think it was 58 versus 3,000 versus 4,000, something like that. In Nissan Leafs, none of them have gone up in flames yet. The fuel cell EV, yeah, wait till they're available. Well, they've been for sale or mostly for lease for a while. They're pretty much disappearing. I think several of the fleets are sold off. The hydrogen refueling networks are actually closing overseas. One of the Shell actually closed all theirs in North America recently, and it's getting very hard to refuel them. It's pretty much like this early days electric car when you could get electricity in the CBDs of the biggest cities in the world, and that was it. Except hydrogen is now disappearing rather than expanding. Negligible refueling capacity, as I said, and you're using 3 to 5 times as much electricity to generate hydrogen to move the car as it would be to just charge it in the first place. And that's assuming using green energy, which we have limited numbers of anyway. So trying to run the grid as a hydrogen economy is not really a good idea. Yeah, a lot of companies are already giving up on it, although they've ended their fuel cell electric vehicle development. So they're pretty much disappearing. I might skip the next slide only because there's sort of a few details there. As I mentioned earlier, there's some numbers there about there's been a myth about more polluting than internal combustion cars. Well, that's the numbers now. I do this analysis every 5 years. First I did it was 2012 in a Renew magazine article, then 2017, and then again in 2022. So every 5 years seems to be a rough number to recycle. It's about 2027. I'll do it again. But it's certainly a lot better already. Even in Victoria with our brown coal, less than 1.41 CO2e equivalent versus 1.5 tons for a Corolla. And if you're running off your own solar or subscribe to green power, it's going to be way better. In South Australia, it's certainly heaps better, as you can see there. It's 1/3. In Tasmania, it's less than a sixth. And that's using the government's own accounting system. People keep saying you're going to bring down the grid, all that smart charging and controlling stuff. At the moment, we've got so few EVs, it's not a problem. But if you have a properly managed EV charging network with smart charging, that blue line is what's going to happen. Peak available supply, they say if every car changed to EV overnight, we probably need 10% more power than is needed now. But we've got probably 20 plus years to get to that point, so the grid will be fine. Again, I just talked about that. I might skip that. EVs made with polluting minerals mined by children. This is always a bit of a hoary chestnut. It's not an EV. It's all mining does damage. So culprit mostly is cobalt. Many manufacturers, Volvo, Tesla, a number of BMW are actually trying to source ethical cobalt. It's less than 10% of an EV battery and is being phased out anyway, so I wouldn't get too stressed about it. Few transition practicalities. Switchboard may need changing. That calls for electricians. You should not ever be told you need to upgrade the power supply, but you may need a new switchboard if you've got that type of switchboard. Got somewhere to charge off street. It gets a little tricky, but there are options. These are all referring to articles in Renew. The right electricity tariff. Make sure you get the one that suits your needs rather than one that charges you like a wounded bull during the time you actually wanted to charge. As I said, the smartish and dumb charges. Those extra leads for the BYO, I have one thrown in the boot. If you do travel off the beaten DC track, those are quite handy, but 95% of people won't need one. And they're all available on my website anyway. EV information, there's a set of fact sheets, a summary page of all the currently EV passenger cars and light commercials on the market. Also another sheet for what's coming and a new one that just started last month for all the second-hand prices and options. So a summary page like that. And for all the new cars on the market now, they are a double-page fact sheet with all the same headings. These are all at the QR code is coming up. And when they go to second-hand, they can move to a second-hand thing, so what to look for in a second-hand vehicle. And that's AV, Australian Electric Vehicle Association.au/fact sheets, or that QR code. Again, email me for the presentation and I'll send it to you, and the links are there. If you've got some more information, Renew organisation I've alluded to several times, and the people running this presentation tonight. A number of articles there. As I said, the next Renew magazine we'll have on watercraft. The Australian Electric Vehicle Association has a website and a forum for asking questions. And it's free to join the forum. Certainly, I would recommend joining, but if you just want to ask a few questions, there's a really good knowledge base there too. Some websites, obviously I write for the Driven, so can recommend that maybe. There's the Electric Vehicle Council, as they proudly represent the electric vehicle industry, but they do some really good stuff, and they're doing more informative stuff all the time. But always remember, they do represent the vehicle industry, so you might get their side of the world a little bit occasionally. And my own website for some of the stuff that I've just mentioned for that EV information. And I think that's it for the night. And I'm run about a minute over, so sorry about that, Jeremy. EV news at bigpond.com if you want a copy of the slides. Thank you very much, and hopefully I didn't speak too fast and got through all the information.
Bryce, fantastic. Thank you. I think you spoke at an admirable speed. That was really good. I think the delivery was perfect. You obviously have covered a breadth of information, really, really good. So I don't know if the other people who are in the call are quite as enthused. We've got a few questions, which is great to see. I just wanted to say, you were talking a lot about Renew magazine and the Renew as an organisation. It's worth pointing out that those magazines, if you do want to get them in hard copy as well, and perhaps you don't want to order back issues, that sort of thing, because not everyone has the money to spend, they are available at our local library network here in Adelaide, South Australia as well. The library networks is all integrated as well, so even if you borrow them from one library, you can return at any other library. And you can also order them between libraries as well. So a great resource. I mean, I do that quite often with Renew and Sanctuary magazines, which are brilliant. I just wanted to go back. I mean, before we get onto the questions, I was interested on your reflection on the major auto manufacturers who are heading towards EV world. And I thought the one that seemed to be conspicuously absent from that list was Toyota. I've read quite a bit of commentary around Toyota that they might have put their eggs in one basket, so to speak, with hydrogen and hybrid technology.
Yes.
What do you think of that in terms of that evolution of models that are available, and considering that Toyota is, I think, still the biggest manufacturer in the world of automobiles?
Although they're not the seller of the most popular vehicle on the market anymore. That's the Tesla Model Y now. And BYD are catching up on that. So Toyota have already lost the mantle of the most popular car in the world. The Corolla has been knocked off. Hopefully they don't have a Kodak moment. In terms of they basically invented the electric car in some ways with their very good hybrid technologies and the Prius when they first came out. But they seem to have just stuck trying to flog what is effectively becoming a dead horse, which is a bit of a worry. They did have plug-in hybrid versions of the Prius overseas, but they never brought them here apart from a few evaluation cars. So they really put their eggs in that basket of the hydrogen and the plug-in hybrids as the interim step to the hydrogen. And as I've alluded to, but I didn't want to go too deeply in, the hydrogen economy is just not going to happen. The fuel cell car has pretty much run its day already. So, and all the Japanese manufacturers are in that boat. That's the worrying part. They've got basically 5 major manufacturers, and they're all basically going to struggle there unless somebody puts an awful lot of it. Toyota, I know, have a skunk work, so to speak, in China. Developing electric cars. One of the Toyota family is over there as the head of it. So they are working on them. They just don't talk about it very much. That's where the BZ4X came from.
And it'd be interesting to see what they bring to market. So that's their consideration. If anyone wants to actually see what the Toyota the Toyota hydrogen car is like, some of you might recall a program called Top Gear, with some illustrious presenters, one of them being James May, who's an extraordinary gentleman, but he was a great exponent of the Toyota hydrogen car. And there's some wonderful videos of him driving it around, talking about how wonderful it is, but how he has to drive something like a 50-kilometre round trip to refuel the thing.
Whereas an electric car, you have you park it in the driveway, plug it in, and walk in the door.
So and I had this exact feeling the other night. So I don't own an electric car. I have other electric vehicles. They're two-wheel variety, bicycles and cargo bikes. I don't visit petrol stations very often, though. I don't do a lot of driving. And I felt particularly affronted after a busy Friday and it was, late. It was starting to get dark, and the car's little feed me light had come on, and it was. I had to go and fill the bloody thing up, and not only was the pump really, really slow, and so it was just ticking over, click, click, click. It was noisy, and it was so stinky. I was standing there in the stink of petrol fumes going, if I had an electric vehicle, I could just drive home and plug the thing in. I'm not going to drive it again today. So I had that little EV epiphany moment that I'm sure a lot of EV owners experience, where you're not having to stand at those dirty, stinking petrol stations, slowly filling up your car, which I think for about 45 litres cost me, over $80. So it's, I'm sorry, why am I doing this? Anyway,
back to choosing cars. I also
Yes.
try and make the point, changing to electric is a really good time to evaluate your real car needs.
Yeah.
Part of it is the changes in fringe benefits tax. So a lot of people bought the dual cab 4-wheel drives purely because it was a work vehicle. And they thought they had a fringe benefits tax exemption to avoid paying fringe benefits tax in the home for a logbook, which wasn't entirely true anyway. But fringe benefits tax has been exempted entirely from EV, so you can drive it 100% private, and you still can take it out of pre-tax earnings. So it's a lot of new leases aren't being 4-wheel drive utes anymore; they're becoming just EVs because people realise they did
so much sense. Yeah.
There was an accidental push into pushing Australia into 4-wheel drive utes. It wasn't that people went, and we're a big country, want to have 4-wheel drive ute. It is we can claim it on the business and we can not pay fringe benefits tax versus buying a passenger car of the same sort of value. So that's how it happened. So they've sort of deliberately done it this time to say, okay, well, we're giving it a real fringe benefits tax exemption, but it's only on EVs. And also that ends for the plug-in hybrids in 2025, so next year.
Excellent.
There'll only be battery electric vehicles from that date.
Yeah. That's such a good news story coming down the pipe as well. The notion about having, I think, a little cheat sheet of your EV myth debunking bullet points, I think, is really important, because the cobalt question, aren't EVs more polluting? The embodied life cycle costs, and all these other terms that people can throw at you because they're trying to sort of chink, put a little chink in the EV transition. This happened to be at lunch. I was having lunch with some people on Friday, and one of the guys at the table just threw this thing at me. Oh, EVs are so polluting, and where does the cobalt come from, and all this sort of stuff. And we went out into the car park afterwards, and I went, I bet that's your car. And it was a bright orange Ford Ranger. And I was just like, dude, why you talking to me about vehicles that pollute? I love him, but it was just like,
I'm often writing articles to debunk these sort of things. So if you go to the Driven, it's I did a batch a while ago. I think it was about 10 of them. That's got around bit now. I just wrote one a couple of days ago on there's this urban myth going around that they're so much heavier that they do damage to the roads and things. But if you do a comparison of like the Kona versus petrol versus electric, for the smaller battery it's 11% heavier. For the bigger battery it's 17% better. I did it for a number of others, the Volvos, and a couple of others, Genesis, that have a direct petrol equivalent of the same body, 10 to 15% heavier. So that's not really going to make a difference in terms of its damage to the road. It's all these big SUVs and 4-wheel drive utes that are way heavier. Another number that someone came up and told me about was when their Tesla Model 3 weighs exactly the same as an old Commodore. The early Commodores that came out. And they're lighter than the cars that you could buy now.
Crazy. We've got a few questions coming through, so I should address those. One of them from Tanya I love. So if you're buying, this is the scenario. So if you're buying a small EV next week that you would like to use for vehicle to home as soon as economically feasible, what vehicles would you be choosing from?
At the moment,
if you're happy to share maybe what you might.
At the moment, you can't buy a small EV that will do vehicle to home or grid, but you can buy quite a number that will do vehicle to load.
Right.
So you can plug a 3-pin adapter into the charge port and then plug a lead into it. So if you do have a power outage, you can just run an extension lead in and run a couple of lamps and a fridge. And that's really all you, to me, that probably will be the most useful. Personally, I'm not a great fan of vehicle to home or grid because it's quite expensive to put a box on the wall. You might be paying $5,000 to $10,000 to install it. And you've got to plug it in every time you're home to use it. So why would you want to do that all the time? Versus if you get a car with vehicle to load, if you do need power out of it, a couple of extension leads in your fridge and a couple of lights and the TV are running.
Do you see the future, though, being more of that bi-directional interface, particularly if the car's not being driven every day? It sits there effectively being a battery on wheels. So it's got that directional.
It's got the option,
yeah.
but how, my early EVs, you would plug them in every night you came home. And actually, one of the things that I noticed when I got the Kona, that I was only plugging in every 2 to 3 weeks, going a bit like petrol stations. I'm really pleased not having to plug in every night. So it gets annoying. So plugging in order to take advantage of that vehicle to grid tariff or whatever, versus just plugging a car in to recharge it off your own solar when you wanted to. For those are times that you did need some power out, or camping. Vehicle to load would be really handy camping. And I've done presentations, for instance, where we've Kia EV6 has a 15 amp capacity. We've plugged in a full electric barbecue, an induction cooktop, and LED lighting because it was in the evening. Fed 40 people from the barbecue, and then I drove home again.
Brilliant.
And it's just so 15 amp, I think, is a nice number for being able to do vehicle load. The BYD and the MGs do about 8-10 amps, which will do a little coffee maker or toaster, but you won't be able to do a whole extra the next 50, up to 15 amps. Seems to be a sort of nice number. But either way, it's a really handy function to have anywhere.
Yeah, and obviously in a domestic situation, that vehicle to load is going to be great in a power outage or, where you've got an extended blackout. I actually found a similar situation. I had a 3.5-day blackout where I live here in Adelaide, and we actually had a live power line lying in the street outside our house, burning a hole in the ground, which wasn't much fun. I'm glad it didn't actually fall on my car. That's another story. But we had
it's vehicle to grid in a way you don't want to have.
Yes, but we did have some electric vehicles in our shed. We had 3 e-bikes, all of which had USB power out on their batteries. So we were able to at least keep our phones running. We might not have been able to cook a meal, but we could keep our essential communications in order. So we didn't have to go into a complete communications blackout at the same time. So very, very handy to have some high capacity batteries lying around, which literally charge the phones for days, that sort of thing.
I just saw a question come in from, is it Gemma, about replacement batteries?
Yes. I had a similar one as well. I have a friend who has a Nissan Leaf, which is hitting about 80 kilometres of range now. Worthwhile thinking about that sort of thing?
It's an interesting question. Up until a year or two ago, we'll go back to that graph that I showed where the battery prices are coming down exponentially. So the Nissan Leaf, when it first came out, was about $30,000 for a new battery. But all the batteries that had problems were replaced under warranty, so you got them for free anyway. And nowadays you can get a new Nissan Leaf battery installed by the dealer for about $10,000, $11,000. So that's sort of numbers. When my Kona first came out, its battery was worth about $32,000, I think. So that's 5 years ago. Mine Kona was one of the very early ones, so they replaced 70,000 batteries around the world without a manufacturing flaw.
Wow.
No question to ask, they just replaced it. So brand new battery went in January last year, so just over 12 months. And when I took it to the dealer, they went, "Oh, batteries are expensive." And I went, "How much?" $15,000 trade. So it had halved in price in 3.5 years. So yes, price is coming down. You can put a new battery in Mitsubishi IMEV aftermarket that someone's now doing. Gives you double the range. It was 120 Ks originally, 110, 120 is now 230, 240 if you get this new battery. And it's about $16,000 fitted. On the other hand, some of this, up until maybe 12 months ago, that was worthy of looking at. Nissan Leaf, you can put in a bigger aftermarket battery now for about $20,000 instead of that $10,000 that gives it its original 130K range. However, the prices have come down so much in second-hand vehicles that you can buy a second-hand Renault Zoe with a 40 kilowatt hour battery and about a 270, 300 kilometer range for about 22 to 25,000. So you're
Yeah.
starting to go, it would have been worth it a year or two ago, but
Weigh it up. Yeah.
weigh it up. But the
Yeah. Yeah.
batteries will generally last the life of the car. So
Yeah.
it's very unusual. Those early batteries, I have a Mitsubishi i-MiEV as well, and it still does 70 Ks out of its 110 originally. It's good for running around, good for just leaving at the depot the other side of Melbourne when I borrow test cars. Um,
Excellent.
I know
Yeah.
plenty of people with the Leafs. Doug, who's doing the backroom stuff tonight, actually has an old Leaf,
Yeah.
and Beetles around it. I think has 80 odd Ks range left. You're surprised how much you can get, how far you can get with 70 or 80 Ks. But the newer cars, they last a lot better anyway. So they're saying the Teslas lose 0.5 to 1% battery capacity a year. So if you buy a car with 500k range now, in 10 years' time, you've lost 25 to 50 kilometers range, which around town, you're not going to notice. You'll
Yeah.
just never notice that. If you're doing a Adelaide to Melbourne trip, you might be stopped for an extra 10 minutes charging.
Yeah.
10
Yeah.
years a time. So you're not going to, for most cars, you're not going to replace the battery in the life of the car.
Yeah. Yeah.
So two answers. One is they don't die when the warranty runs out, unlike mobile phones, but more like the internal combustion engine petrol car, they don't die when the 5-year warranty runs out. They generally go pretty much the life of the car, and the
Yeah.
battery will be pretty much equivalent to the motor in a petrol car.
And I've heard there's quite a good recyclability of the batteries at the end of their life in a four-wheel vehicle as well, and some are being
Yep.
repurposed as home battery storage as well, because
Yep.
they're more
So
than
there's
ample for
two
that
sides
capacity.
to old batteries. One is they don't die suddenly; they just
Yeah.
just lose capacity if they do go.
Yeah.
In which case they're good for putting into storage systems, and they'll
Yeah.
last another 10, 15 years there. So once they reach about 20, 25 years, they're up to I think 90 something percent recyclable already. And
Mm.
Europe are bringing in regulations that all of the car, not just the battery, but the battery included, must have a full, must be built to be easily recycled and must be virtually fully recyclable. So that's coming in now.
That's brilliant. Yeah. Um, there's a question here. You might have covered it in your enthusiasm, but Judy asks, why did you buy a Kona? So back then, what was the thing? Was it just the vehicle of choice at that stage? And would you buy another one, I guess?
Interesting enough, I wrote an article about this about a year ago because it was actually I was I was actually lined up on that first day when the Tesla Model 3 reservations opened in Australia and put a
Right.
deposit down. And then as the specs came out for it, I just went, it's not really the car I want. I wanted a smaller car, not a larger one, because they kept saying it
Mm.
was a small car, and it turned out not to be. It was small by American standards, but it was large by Australian standards. It was a sedan, not a hatch, and I wanted a hatch to put things in the back. I
Mm-hmm.
really don't like that dashboard layout. It's just I'm an
Mm.
old-fashioned knobs and dials person with a binnacle in
Mm-hmm.
front of me, and the Tesla is a very much computer or person-oriented car, and people that like that style love it. And the Volvo EX30 is very much that same aesthetic, but for some people it doesn't suit, and it didn't suit me, and a couple of other reasons. And then the Kona finally arrived, and I started measuring it up. Basically, I wrote a tick list, and the Kona won out by a mile, and it was $30,000 cheaper for
Yeah.
better range. For
Okay.
so I could spend maybe 10 grand more in a Tesla for less range, or nearly 30 grand more to get slightly more range than the Kona. But the Kona had a hatch, it had a driver's display and knobs and buttons, and it just went, the Kona wins.
Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. Honest answer. I like that. Thank you, Bryce. Yeah. Um, question here. Can you expand a little more on what you found out about the Volvo XC30? Is it well tested and good value for money for a retiree who wants to plug in at home?
I haven't driven the Volvo XC30 yet, so I've only sat in one.
Okay.
The first ones are rolling out to the dealers over the weekend and last week, so I've just popped around and basically managed to find a little slot between all the customers that put in reservations to have a look at it.
Yeah.
So I actually wrote an article for the Driven, so there's a preview article there.
Yeah.
Um, so it's very well put together, but it is the Tesla aesthetic. So it is everything's done through the central screen or the buttons on the steering wheel.
Yeah.
So it's a little more button driven than the Tesla is. So it's got better steering wheel buttons and things, but it is very much that aesthetic of, if you like, a screen driven computer interface rather than a knobs and dials driver display
Mm-hmm.
type approach. So retiree might be more used to the older style of car. So I actually just drove the new Kona. Unplug a Kona again. Pretty much returned it yesterday, and it
Mm.
has a good driver's display aesthetic, really nicely set up, good knobs and dials. Once you work out how to turn off the very annoying speed sign recognition, it constantly gets it wrong. So it kept telling you were doing the wrong speed when you weren't. It was a very nice, pleasant car to drive. But and for plugging in at home, pretty much any car will do the job. So there's no, the new Kona will do vehicle to load. The new EX30 doesn't. So Hyundai all do the vehicle to load, and technically the Ioniq 5, Ioniq 6, so the eGMP platform will do vehicle to home and grid, but they don't advertise it yet.
Right. Right.
So if you're a retiree looking for somewhere to plug in, it depends on the aesthetic. So that no knobs and dials or more traditional. If you want vehicle to load, then you're going to look at MG4. So the BYDs, they all do vehicle to load. The Kona does a 15 amp vehicle to load. The MGs and the BYDs do 8-9 amps. I like 15 amps, having trialed both, and going 15 amps just seems to be a nice number. So not that I'm trying to sell the Hyundai Konas, but if they're looking at something, and the Kona is cheaper than the X30 as well.
I gather that it hit a feature and price point for you, and that was the deciding, very much a deciding factor for it.
But there are other cars. I mean, the feature and price point, the MGs or the BYDs may hit their price point. They've certainly got the knobs and dials. They've got the more traditional aesthetic, and they do have vehicle to load. But they might be 10, 15 grand cheaper.
Right.
20 grand if you look at the longer range. Actually, no, probably 10, 15 range for range.
Yeah. What would be your favourite second-hand EV in the market currently?
Can I say Hyundai Kona? But no, not entirely true. It's the Renault Zoe. If you don't want to go out of town, because it doesn't have DC fast charge, but it is very good otherwise. We bought one for my partner. She has a Renault Zoe, or the original Hyundai Ioniq. There's two sizes: 28 kilowatt hour and 38 kilowatt hour, and you can pick up early 28 kilowatt hour for about 25 grand second hand now, and a 38 for about 30 grand. The Zoe's for low 20s, the low to mid 20s. So you got some quite good choice in the second hand coming up. If that fact sheet that I mentioned with the second hand models, they're listed there for you with their range, their battery size.
Did you said that, I think you said in your presentation, that 1 in 10 vehicles are EVs in Australia now. 1 in 10 being sold are EVs in Australia now. Right.
Yeah, so about 10% new car sales are a full battery electric vehicle.
That's fantastic. So we should expect
battery plug-in, should say battery electric plus PHEV, but there's a very small percentage is PHEV.
Right. So that's good, I guess, for the second-hand market, because we'll expect to see some churn. I'm assuming that 1 in 10 includes fleet vehicles as well. So, councils, for instance,
just
buy a fleet of vehicles and then we'll turn them over in a number of years, that sort of thing.
If you're looking for picking up some fleet cars, keep an eye on the auctions in the ACT, because they had a policy of buying EV only a year or two ago, and they said they would turn them over early after maybe a couple of years to push cars into the second-hand market. So they will be appearing in the next few months on the ACT market.
Okay. There seems to be a lot more options these days for sourcing second-hand vehicles. Obviously, not everyone's got 40 to 60K to drop on on an entry-level price for an EV. So it's good to hear.
I have a 2012 Leaf and a 2012 IMEV. There's a question from Keith.
Yes.
That's more comments.
Yeah. There's a comment, but there seems to be Adelaide. Keith also says Adelaide has a 100% EV bus on the road. What do you know about that? Maybe that was the Tindo bus. I
don't know about that one in Adelaide, but in Victoria, there's about 4 to 6. I think Doug may know more than I do on that. But I have been driving around behind some buses that say 100% electric, and I believe Adelaide's got more than Melbourne. So
thanks, Keith. Yeah, so Keith has just clarified it's a Torrens Transit. So I'm sorry, Keith, I don't know anything about that either. I know Torrens Transit, but in terms of their EV, but it's something I'll look into, seeing which routes it's servicing in particular, that sort of thing. It's always interesting to know.
Yeah, buses are particularly good for conversion because they have a regular route, almost to the meter, how far they're going to go in a day. So you can size the battery accordingly and pop the chargers in the right spots. And if all else fails, there's plenty of DC chargers popping up that they could stop at if they had to.
Yeah, no, easy. The point you made earlier about fires is another interesting point, because that's another one that comes up with the debunkers. I think it's quite interesting. I always point out to people, say, but EVs catch fire, and I say, well, no, they don't. You actually just don't hear all the internal combustion engines that catch fire, because there's a lot more fires with ICE cars than there are with EVs. But
you saw the stats there. That was from the insurance companies. Over 100,000 car sales.
Because they're so common, we just don't report them. We don't actually register them anymore. But if an EV catches fire, it's like, obviously.
So if you're driving around,
often
on highways and things, you sort of see this black patch and a little bit of bitumen that's been sort of missing. That's where a car fire's been. So often you'll see them on the side of the highways, and that they've all been car fires, but you just don't hear about them.
Yeah. Oh dear, yes. It's an interesting thing. And I can't resist, because obviously I have a bit of a passion for e-bikes and cargo bikes, and I really like electric cars as well. I think they're brilliant. I'm seeing certainly discussions online with some of the groups I'm involved in, who people would like to get an electric car, but they can't afford one. So they're seeing, the e-bike and the e-cargo bike as a much more affordable entry-level option into the world of e-mobility. I was just wondering, maybe as a closing comment, Bryce, whether you might sort of see where that market is perhaps evolving, in comparison to the personal car, and whether we might see some sort of saturation point with other forms of personal mobility solutions as well.
I think we've all seen Deliveroos and all those. It's virtually every delivery vehicle is an electric bike now. It's almost, who hasn't tried to be run over by one? Many of them around. So when it comes to transport, there's the little local, or even little motorbikes and scooters. Lots of people aren't taking their cars anymore for those pizza deliveries. They're all electric push bikes, basically. So a lot of those old pizza delivery cars have gone and moving to that, which is a much more sensible thing. Cargo bikes are more popular overseas. There's no reason not for them to be popular here. It's just a cultural thing. So for local shopping, an electric cargo bike would be ideal.
Yeah, I just see there's a very big cargo bike community in Adelaide, and it's growing all the time. I normally see about half a dozen every day. So
that's the thing. It's just getting that.
It's nice to see. It's a critical mass thing.
Mass thing, and then you get a cultural acceptance of them, which is just. It was at one of the Scandinavian countries. They're very big into electric bicycles and cargo bikes and all that. And it's just the cultural thing of when it takes root, like you're finding there, then it'll just start spreading around.
Brilliant. Bryce, thank you so much for this evening. Thank you to Renew for helping us to host these seminars. Thank you to you all out there who joined us tonight for this discussion.
Thank you. Good questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It's been a really nice discussion. So for those of you who've stuck with us, or even those who left early, they probably would have seen this already. There is a bit of a follow-up survey. You should receive that as you log out of the call. Please fill that in straight away while things are still fresh in your minds. This session has been recorded. Once we've got that transcript, we will upload it to the Regional Climate Partnership website. So AdaptWest, Resilient East, Resilient South, and Resilient Hills and Coast. And thank you to all those other regional climate partnerships who, along with AdaptWest, have been hosting this series over the past year. It's been a really good series of seminars and a great repository of information that you can go back to and have a look at a whole range of topics that we've covered around household retrofit, choosing the right builder, assembling your team, electric vehicles, electrification, keeping warm or cool in winter and summer. As we head into winter in Australia, you might even want to revisit some of those keeping warm in winter seminars. There was one specifically for renters and one for homeowners. So thank you again. Thanks to Renew for helping us to host these. So this is the last webinar in this series, and go back and revisit them. Feel free to send us an email or a message if you love them, or any comments on what you'd like to see done differently in the future. But yeah, thank you for joining us this evening, and we may see you again in the future. Cheers.
Yeah. Thank you.